Good afternoon. Welcome, Ashanti.
Hi,
So,
thanks for having me.
so on stage now we have the wonderful Ashanti from Diversity Ally, who's going to be doing a session on supply chain diversity. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Gabby and I, so Gabby is my co-founder at Diversity Ally. She sends her good vibes and also well wishes along with me. But today, for a few minutes, you've got to put up with me. So we are going to be talking about diversifying your supply chain. And this is a really, really interesting topic to talk about. It's something that sometimes is quite forgotten in the events industry, and traditionally what you'll see is the word procurement used on various pieces. So we're going to be talking about diversifying your supply chain. My name's Ashanti, and if we just move on to the next slide, you are able to ask questions throughout all of this. So please do not hesitate to ask questions in the chat function. Any question, no question is silly, for example. Questions and conversation are often the best way to learn and really get some answers to how we can actually diversify the supply chain in a very practical way in the events industry. Just a brief overview. Diversity Ally, we specifically help the events industry become more diverse and inclusive so that it reflects the wonderful work that we do and the many, many communities and sectors that we cross and serve. So you can find us anywhere, and we have some brilliant resources which we'll talk about towards the end of this presentation that you can take advantage of, listen to, read discreetly, and or share within your teams so that you can look at the ways you can be more diverse and inclusive. So the question really is on the next slide, why is this important? Why does this even matter? And you can see here, these are the things that we're going to look at today. Nice and simple. What does the supply chain mean? What do we mean by diversify the supply chain? What are the benefits for you as a planner, as a business for doing so? Where do you start? That's often the next question that comes along. So after we learn all of this, how do we start? Where do we start? How do we actually get the buy-in from maybe our managers or the stakeholder who holds the budget? There can be some challenges to overcome once you've committed to diversifying your supply chain. So what I'm going to talk about just for a moment is what we actually mean by diversity and inclusion. This year of all years, you've probably seen diversity and inclusion talked about all over in various different capacities. And if you are on social media, which most of us are, we are seeing a lot of information about diversity and inclusion. And sometimes that can be quite confusing. We're not sure what it all means. What context does this fall into? So I thought it might be useful, really, just to share with you an overview, a simple explanation as to what we mean when we talk about diversity and inclusion. Okay, in the workplace, in business, and yes, in the supply chain. So, diversity and inclusion is really about the redistribution of resources, access, resources, access, and power. So the redistribution, it's about leveling the playing field. And there's some really interesting pieces that I'm going to share with you in this presentation. But when we think about it, what we want to do is ensure that everyone has equal access, equal opportunity for resources, power, and also within the supply chain, when we're talking about a sector like the events industry, in terms of financial freedom, an opportunity to grow their business, but also for you as the planner or the company who's looking at how you diversify your supply chain, it's about how you can leverage a more competitive market, how you can invest in local and national economies by committing to diversifying your supply chain. What tends to happen very often is that companies shy away from doing anything because they're not sure how to and where to start. And I'll let you into a little secret. The brilliant thing about the supply chain and diversifying that supply chain is that you have a little bit more freedom than you think. And actually, there's some great work you can do in terms of contributing to maybe a wider ethos of diversity and inclusion that your business might have. Because the supply chain is what we call at Diversity Ally a quick win. And those don't come around very often. All right. So the supply chain is a great opportunity for you to make quick changes, to be able to demonstrate quickly to your business, but also to the industry that we work in, that you are committed to being diverse and inclusive. Now, I'm not expecting you to remember everything I share in this presentation. That's one of the reasons why Diversity Ally has worked to make sure that the benchmarks that I refer to throughout this presentation are accessible to you. So they're not secret. You will be able to go and read in some detail about what the supply chain, diversifying your supply chain means. On the website. So we've listed out what that means with some very practical prompts for you as a business to look at. But what we will do is move on to the next slide and start talking about this in some more detail. So what we really see ultimately, if you're looking at this slide along with me, is that corporate procurement, so there's that word again, does have a diversity problem. Okay, so we can see that business leaders have put more emphasis over the last 5 years on diversity and inclusion. We can see that. But unfortunately, the figures are not showing that that is rising. And that's from a recent Diverse Suppliers report. So what we're going to be talking about today is what we can do to change that. And on the next slide, and that slide will change in a moment. So you are in a prime position because once you've got your budget somewhat even confirmed, signed off, and also when you go back to reviewing who your preferred suppliers are, when those junctures come up in your year, these are the opportunities that you have to review the suppliers that you are using. And I'm going to talk about what counts as a diverse supplier, because you'd be surprised how broad this could actually be, which gives you a lot more flexibility. And again, that kind of higher rate of success if you try this. But, you know, this is the opportunity that you have to create some economic and moral value, not only for your company, but also for your local area and society. And here's the thing, we know this is happening anyway in the events industry, right? Depending on the types of events that you're planning, even if you are a venue for that matter, you may well already be using and working with and partnering with local businesses, for example. So this is actually all part of diversifying the supply chain. And we'll just move on to the next slide so I can give you a bit more detail about the economic and moral value that this indeed provides to you and your company. Again, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat because Sarika will let me know and we'll cover them towards the end of the session. So what does it mean? So supplier diversity, it's about enabling, okay, activating, again, opening up this access, redistributing resources, opportunities to all companies. And that's regardless, where possible, of their size, geography, workplace, the nationality, so that everyone can, and note these keywords, compete, bid, or tender, or apply, or at least gain access to supply you goods and services. So we're just going to break that down a little bit more, right? So it's about, regardless of a company's maybe geography, size, makeup, we are giving them equal opportunity to become preferred suppliers, equal opportunity to enter into the supply chain. Now, you might well be a business that has been thinking about what practical things you can do to demonstrate your commitment to diversity and inclusion. And this is a really good one. And it's one of the, actually, if you think about it, the supply chain directly maps back to that economic value. Where you may have seen resources out there that have really talked about how we can improve the economy and contribute to the economy of maybe marginalized groups or protected groups, etc. The supply chain is a brilliant, brilliant way of doing that. Okay. So even if you have a tender process, even if you had a bidding process, or you do review suppliers periodically, for example, and by the way, you could decide to do this at any time. Maybe you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, we were due for a review anyway, or we haven't done it in quite some time. This is a good opportunity to look through who those suppliers are. And I will go on to talk about how you do quality assurance, because I know that tends to be a common concern when we talk about diversifying the supply chain. But we'll cover that in a moment. So, and I love this term, by the way, inclusive procurement. So it's about turning it on its head, right? It's not a problem to be solved. It could be an underutilized resource that is sitting right there, waiting for you as a business to take advantage of, right? So it's about proactive activity, okay? Proactive activity, where you go out, to make sure that relevant and potential suppliers have fair and equal opportunity to compete. So I'll give you a very real example. We see some businesses, okay, large companies, publishing companies who run a number of events, hundreds of events really a year. And when we've looked into their supply chain, all of the companies in their supply chain, okay, are of a certain size. Some of those suppliers haven't changed for years. And actually, if we're quite honest, and we one of the things at Diversity Allies, we gather a kind of plethora of different types of data and research. But anecdotally, what we see is that, especially for maybe founded businesses that you might be starting as an individual with a friend or as a family, and you've grown, maybe you've acquired some funding along the way, is we tend to use suppliers that we know, that we might be friends with, or that we've worked with prior at other times. And so what can happen sometimes is that supply chain is quite sticky, which is a good thing if you're in sales, right? You love that word sticky. But in this context, that can be a little bit of a problem in terms of diversifying our supply chain, because sometimes we just tend to work with people we know, and we understand that an element of trust and convenience may have been built up with some of our preferred supplier lists. But for the most part, we are seeing that companies may not be activating, may not be proactively diversifying the supply chain in the way that they can, that is both mutually beneficial for them, but also the suppliers that they are giving access to, introducing into that supply chain. If you have any questions about that, please do let me know. So, okay, we've looked at what diversifying or supplier diversity really is. It's about inclusivity. It's about redistribution of access, okay, opening up opportunities, being really honest as a company when you choose who you work with. And there are larger companies who, of course, have many processes and systems in place that influence and inform their supplier, processes, programs, and the chain. But even so, take real stock of this. Look at this, because this is a quick win in a way for you to demonstrate your commitment to diversity and inclusion. So as we move on to the next slide then, who do we actually mean, or what do we mean when we talk about supplier diversity? What do we actually mean? Because you might be thinking, Ashanti, okay, so how are we meant to look for them? How can we identify them from our current lists? How can we look outwardly, externally for them? So diverse businesses are managed, owned, or are businesses who employ, bit of a mouthful there. So the diverse business is either managed, owned, or they employ minority groups like women, persons with disabilities, members of visible mature workers. So we're talking about age here, representation, youth, and those who are part of the LGBTQ community. Okay, so that I thought was a really important thing to discuss and point to put in, because I know often the question comes back, what is actually a diverse business? And that can include micro, small, and medium enterprises. Broadly speaking, you're looking at fewer than 10, fewer than 50, fewer than 250 employees, respectively, and social enterprises as well. We see some great examples of larger companies really working with social enterprises, for example, for their catering. There's a brilliant social enterprise that provides catering services within the events industry. And so larger companies work with them because actually the work that this social enterprise does in terms of who they employ, who they retrain, who they are contributing to the local economy with, it means that that company by proxy is contributing to that local economy, contributing to the skills and the training of the employees in that social enterprise catering company, right? So that's a really real example. These are the practical things you can do as an events company, or if you are a corporate booker, or you're buying in services and goods for your venue, for example. The catering is always a really interesting and tasty way to diversify your supply chain, because there are some brilliant, diverse businesses that will fall under this category of being able to supply you goods and services. And so therefore, you're able to contribute to the local economy and also demonstrate your commitment to diversity and inclusion. The other key one in there is local vendors as well. We've seen this happen, and I think sometimes you're probably doing it without really thinking about it and necessarily mapping it back to your diversity and inclusion strategy. But if you use local vendors wherever possible, and appropriate, that is a good and practical way you can continue to diversify your supply chain. What I will say on that note, though, is sometimes if we live in an area, or we work in an area, or we operate in an area that lacks diversity, using just local vendors won't necessarily be enough, right? So we can maybe stretch a little further and think about, that regardless of geography, if it's a service that you can buy in, for example, if you maybe don't have, a headquarters or an office, maybe you don't work that way, you work very virtually, like Gabby and I do, for example, that is a great opportunity for us to diversify our supply chain, because we can work with local vendors, we can work with social enterprises who may not be located in our direct vicinity, but we're able to contract them or open up opportunity for them to provide us with services, and goods. I hope that makes sense. Please do ask any questions that you might have, pop them into the chat. And we can discuss that further in a moment. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide. Lovely. So we've looked at what it is, and now we're going to talk about why it's beneficial. And I probably mentioned this in various ways already. You can tell Gabby and I are real advocates for diversifying the supply chain. So the most successful businesses know that by creating diversity in their supply chain, they can be more agile, for example, right? So you may want to do something different, or you want to try a new product, offer something different to your attendees, your clients. Actually, diversifying that supply chain so you have more choice means you can make decisions much quicker. You can access that good or service quicker. Okay. Also, you are not bound necessarily if you have a limited preferred supplier list as well. You can unlock innovation. This is a really interesting one as well. We see this happening. There are some brilliant businesses out there who have great products, whether it's tech or otherwise, that are very innovative, useful. And so you could actually decide to invest in something cutting edge that gives you that edge over your competition, that provides a better experience maybe for, for your attendees, for example. So it's really, really quite smart to think about diversifying your supply chain along the lines of what we've just discussed, kind of which businesses fall into that category whenever you can, because you give yourself that constant edge, okay, where you can offer more to your clients and your customers. And let's face it, in business, you might want to keep setting yourself apart from your competitors at this time. And, also there is the ethical reason. Sometimes maybe the moral case and the ethical case is enough for some businesses to commit to diversifying the supply chain. Okay, you don't have to maybe really rely on maybe the financial benefit, but maybe the moral case, the ethical case is something that as a company or as a planner who has the budget, as a planner who's in charge of this supply chain, really, really resonates with you. You can also increase competition on price. So this is something that's quite interesting. The more vendors that you've approved of that help you diversify that supply chain, you can actually sometimes get more competitive pricing, okay, between your current and potential vendors. And this is quite an interesting one. We do find that sometimes we might be using a vendor for quite some time, and not realize that maybe we can get better value elsewhere, or actually doing a little bit of a market mapping, you may be able to go back to them with some insights and get more competitive pricing, which is always quite useful as well. Also, you can demonstrate your company's commitment to doing business in multicultural markets. So this is really interesting. Gabby and I often, talk to venues, and there are some practical things. For example, if you are a venue, like the catering, for example, those are like, real quick wins, okay, in terms of working in multicultural markets. Maybe you maybe have a themed event, or indeed your clients might be of a certain culture. And so how can you offer them a better service? And this is one of the areas you can, by diversifying that supply chain that you have, so that you can meet their needs, essentially. And something that we all talk about, especially during this COVID time, isn't it very interesting how local economies have become so vital and so important at this time? This year, more than ever, small and local businesses have both suffered, but also have benefited because of proximity. I know in my local area, when the supermarkets at the beginning of that lockdown piece, were absolutely empty, local independent grocers and coffee shops, for example, who started stocking other groceries and items, they really saw a boom because of the circumstances, because of proximity. We as residents and local people were able to strengthen our local economies because we weren't necessarily commuting. We weren't traveling maybe into the city, for example, for a period of time. And so some of the things that we would have bought maybe on our commute at lunchtime, etc., we were actually purchasing closer to home. Now, of course, we're not suggesting that COVID remains. But what we're saying is that diversifying your supply chain allows you to do your part in building stronger local economies, which of course impacts the wider economy as well. And then here's something that's quite interesting is we're living in a time, particularly when it comes to your clients and consumers, if you're doing consumer facing events and services. When you look at millennials and also Generation Z, their perspective on what they expect from the companies that they work with, the companies they work for, and the companies that they buy from is different now. They really want those companies to be demonstrating the values that they have maybe on their website, or the values that they hold dear to themselves. And this is particularly true of Generation Z as well, because they're the ones who will come into consumer buying power positions. And so what they're looking for is for companies that can demonstrate the values in terms of who they work with and how they work. And again, diversifying the supply chain helps you stay on top of these rapidly growing consumer groups' needs and expectations. So you can improve the levels of customer and consumer satisfaction. You can build stronger communities, whether that is your community of clients, your internal community of peers. This is a great way of including, not only including marginalized groups and diverse businesses, but also really showing from an ethical and moral point of view to these generations that are actually becoming the buying consumers, that you care about these issues. So there's a lot in that, and I'm sure you may have many questions. Please feel free to pop them into the chat box. It's no problem. But I thought I'd just do a brief overview over why it's beneficial. So if we move on to the next slide now, here's some practical stuff. Where can we actually start if we're attempting this? So look, there's a lot that we could say on this, but I've kept this very simple and to the point for the purposes of this particular talk presentation. Here's what I'd say to you. You have to address the bias in decision making. So one of the most common comments that we hear when we're doing sessions and we're working through this with businesses is the misconception that greater supplier diversity means more risk and reduced quality in goods and services. Really, what that is, though, is a bias that we may have internally and as an organization that we're not aware is a bias. Okay, so bringing in diverse suppliers, diversifying the supply chain does not automatically mean we are taking a risk, number one, but number two, we are going to receive a lower, reduced or poor quality good or service. And so this is the point at which we have to be very open. We have to be vulnerable and think about what biases we might indeed have. Okay, those biases do affect decision making when it comes to procurement and the supply chain, essentially. So the first thing we always say, we start with what biases do we have? What misconceptions? How honest can we be about what we really think and what we think the problem is? And so sometimes that means that we have a conversation about bias. Ironically, we might have a bias to using a friend's business as a supplier, or we might have a bias for using a particular supplier because we like them, right? That's what happens in business in reality. And so depending on the size of your company and what processes you have in place, we have to be willing to have a conversation about bias and how some ideas and beliefs, which may be quite inaccurate, are preventing us from diversifying the supply chain. Because as I say, this is one of the quick wins that the events industry can really take advantage of. The second thing we can do after we did some work on addressing bias and examining our current supply chain, really being honest, and sometimes what that does mean for some companies is maybe you haven't been keeping the data. You haven't even collected data on the diversity of your supply chain. Maybe you have a statement that goes on maybe contracts or partnership agreements whereby you've said that you support, modern slavery statements or diversity and inclusion more broadly. And the expectation is that your suppliers are doing that too, because we understand you can't tell your suppliers what to do in their own businesses. But after you've thought about, are we collecting data? Can we access data? How do we really find out and map out what our current supply list looks like? Setting goals is a practical thing you can do. So maybe, okay, this year has happened already, but on next year's budget, on next year's periodic review of our supply chain, what are the goals? What things can we do? And then it's key after setting those goals to involve and train all the relevant stakeholders. So maybe even though you do have, you do have some influence or power in your role, you do have to go through layers of sign-off, for example, to be able to introduce different suppliers or present a different way of doing things. And so at that point, it's really important to involve all of the other stakeholders who have a part in the decision making, who may even have a view on what is happening and how it's to be done. Okay, involve them early. And then maybe some training might be needed, again, to go over some of the basics we've talked about this afternoon, but about addressing bias in some of the decisions that we make. And bear in mind that the reality is a lot of these systems and processes have been in place for a long time. If you're a large company, these systems and processes have been in a long time. And so it can take time to change them. But it does require what we call conscious inclusion. And so effort and goal setting will be important. If you're a smaller business, or maybe you work in a team of one or two, you may have more influence. You may be able to be more agile and make changes more quickly, which is brilliant, right? So again, sit down as a team, set the goals, and then think about how can we realistically achieve greater supplier diversity in the future. Again, if you have any questions about that, please do let me know. So I just thought it'd be interesting, maybe really useful to just recap what we've looked at in the last 2 minutes. Okay, so what do we mean by diversifying the supply chain? Well, what we're talking about is the kind of providing equal access and opportunity for businesses of all kinds, okay, to be able to compete, bid, tender, apply to work with you. That's what we mean. What counts as a diverse business? Well, actually, the definition is rather broad. It could be a local vendor or business. It could mean regardless of geography. It could mean businesses that are managed, owned, or significantly employ minorities, for example, like women, persons with disabilities, etc., etc. They could also be social enterprises. So that's what we mean by diversifying the supply chain, and that would be what would count as a diverse business. Why is it beneficial? Well, there's many reasons why it might be beneficial, and Sarika and I will probably answer some of your questions about why it's beneficial in a moment. You can strengthen your local economies. You can demonstrate a commitment to your peers, to your colleagues, and to the communities that you serve, those who may well have the buying power that you are committed to diversity and inclusion. So I hope you found that helpful this afternoon. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through diversifying your supply chain. Sarika?
Thanks, Ashanti, for that really informative and really, really useful session. I think it's not often we hear a topic like this discussed at an events forum, and I think the first kind of question that I had particularly was, how do we encourage this discussion in the industry? How do we ensure that people, are asking these questions?
Yeah, sure. And I think the great thing is that venue and events have even put it on a platform like this. I think that is hugely significant, right? It is where
Yeah,
you have your sphere of influence and you have a community and a platform is putting it on the agenda and being open to talking about, what it actually means and holding space for people to ask what could be quite vulnerable questions because they don't know what they don't know.
definitely. So some of the questions we've had included, like, how often do we actually recommend a supplier reviews its supply chain? Where do we start?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. We're well aware that, for many of us who run businesses, for example, you may not review your supply chain very often, right? But because it's one of the quick win areas as a business, it's useful to start thinking about it now that it's on your radar. Maybe it's something you do twice a year or annually. Or if you're a smaller business, you can do it quarterly. And I think smaller to medium businesses do it more often because ultimately they're trying to make sure they trim the fat. So they're always looking maybe for competitive supply. And so, but maybe if you're a bigger business, we understand that some of these processes and systems may have been in place for years. And so you may not be reviewing that supply chain very often.
Definitely. I was just going to mention, obviously, the C word. Do you think with the situation that we're in, at the moment, this gives us an opportunity to kind of reflect and kind of look at our budgets in a different way and incorporate some of this, diversifying
Yeah.
into that?
Well, to be very pragmatic, I think people have been forced to anyway. They just didn't.
Yeah.
The reason was COVID, because right now, with businesses again trying to trim the fat, they are trying to forecast in very unpredictable times. It's actually quite normal now that people are reviewing their supply chain because are we paying too much? What can we get rid of? Where can we change? Can we get a quicker, faster service? Can we use a more agile company? And this is why it's really useful because right now, if you're trying to get more convenience, if you're trying to get more flexibility with suppliers, this would be a great time to start looking at diverse suppliers.
definitely. I agree there. Obviously, we all know the industry has a long way to go with this, but have you seen any improvement since you guys have started? Obviously, the training and before that, in previous roles, have we seen any improvement in the industry? And can you help us give it with an example? Or
Okay, so what I can say is that what we have definitely seen, Gabby and I, is it's like anything. Once you start the conversation, sometimes the floodgates open, right? It needed
yeah,
someone to start a conversation in the events industry, which is what Diversity Ally did essentially. And what we have seen is that this is something that people have been discussing within their teams and businesses for quite some time, but weren't sure how to move past the talking stage and into the action stage. So I'd say that's a huge positive that because we are so visible and we're so active and open about how the industry can really be a role model as an industry, even in these hard times when it comes to diversity and inclusion, I think it's encouraged people. You and I have had chats. It's
yeah.
it's really opened the floodgates really for people to really share how they feel, what they're thinking, and they in turn have really become champions within their businesses and encouraged the stakeholders in their businesses to look at ways that they can, make a difference.
Of course, I guess it's similar to, when sustainability was first increased and, the awareness arose in the industry. You had the sustainability champion within the office and the industry, and now
Yes.
we need to look to the same with the diversity champions. One
Yeah.
question that's come in, which I think is quite important, is can you say more about how to set the goals and what people should look at when they're setting goals?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really good question. So your goals can be both qualitative and quantitative. Okay. So from a quantitative perspective, it could be that right now you've got no diversity in your supply chain. So maybe you set a goal to have 10% diversity in your supply chain over the next 12 months. And using that kind of guide that we provided as to, what counts as diverse business, when you review your existing supply chain, when you're looking at buying in other goods and services, you start looking more carefully at who these suppliers are. What are their diversity and inclusion values? What commitment do they show to diversity and inclusion? Do they fall into any of those categories we talked about managing, owning, or employing minority groups, for example? Are there social enterprises in your supply list, right? And so that is a quantitative measure that you can take by setting a numerical goal for the number of diverse suppliers in your preferred supplier list. In a qualitative sense, it could be looking at your existing suppliers because who knows, some of them might actually be committed to diversity and inclusion already. But because you haven't necessarily looked at the data, you're not sure at the end of the day. You don't know what you don't know. And what you could do
Exactly.
from a qualitative perspective is maybe, if you've come up with a diversity and inclusion policy recently, share that with your suppliers and partners. Share that on your website. Talk about that openly. That is something still significant and impactful when you let your community know what your intentions are and what commitments you've made in this regard.
100%. And I think just to break it down, if you could give us an idea of your top tips that people can kind of take away from this session to get started, because I know there's a lot of beginners in this process that are obviously
Yeah,
listening in, like
yeah,
everyone is today. No one's an expert
yeah.
in this kind of topic, and it'd be really useful, I think. We've had so many comments saying this is like been an amazing presentation, but what's the first three action points that we need to start with to
Okay, so like I said, on the first one is address your bias. So one of the things that at Diversity Ally we've spent a lot of time doing and continue to do is the education and training piece. So if you are sitting in a company where you know that you haven't had any education or training on diversity and inclusion at all, reach out to us because we can share some resources that you can access in a discreet way. Okay, so we're not talking about posting on social media here. Resources, solid resources for the events industry that you can access to get a good grasp on what we mean by diversity and inclusion and how it applies to maybe your role or business. So that's the first action point, is to reach out to Diversity Ally. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second tip I would give is to at least review your current supplier list. Now, I know this worries some people because sometimes our spreadsheets or systems are not up to date, but you have to start where you're at and know where you're starting from. So the second thing you can do is actually take a look at that supplier list. Are there suppliers on there that you don't really use? Are there suppliers on there that may have shut down? Really look at that, tighten up the list, make it neat, and be honest about how diverse or not that supply list actually is. And then set a goal, set a numerical goal if you have to. And I know sometimes we get a lot of questions about whether or not, it's okay for something to be a tick box exercise. The reality is, when we're talking about conscious inclusion, it has to be as conscious as that. Okay. So if that means you add a task to a process sheet or a list that you use as a business that says, check the diversity of the supplier, that is okay. Because what happens with time is that it becomes an embedded practice and value and ethos. Eventually, you won't even need to look at that checklist because it will naturally be a part of the way you make selections, the way you review, and the way you present suppliers to whoever holds the budget or has that final decision making power. So set a numerical goal. Don't be afraid to add a tick box to the list if that will help you. And then the third thing to do, is look, be open. So it's okay to have a conversation internally about this new intention or the commitment that you'd like to make to diversity and inclusion. As I say, you'd be surprised what other people are thinking and feeling once you start the conversation. Those are some really high level, very practical things that Diversity Ally would encourage you to do if you want to get started, even if you're a beginner.
Definitely. I just had a question from one of my colleagues actually, who studied event
Sure.
management, and she was just saying, obviously, diversifying and wasn't covered in when you was taught event management at university, for example. So, is this something we should now be looking at, considering, training on additional training for event planners? And are there
Absolutely.
any tips
Yeah.
there?
So that's a good question. I mean, look, life has moved along so far in the last 6 months. Look at the fact now that event courses, for example, now have to talk about technology, where before it
Yeah.
might have been, an optional module. It wasn't really something that was covered. Now it's become probably, non-negotiable if you are training the next generation of event planners and managers. And so too, I think very naturally, probably things like the supply chain and diversifying the supply chain and just diversity and inclusion in terms of the way we work with each other to have a healthy workplace culture and do your part to contribute to that is going to be key. And indeed, yes, should be included in formal and informal training courses. But again, that's why Diversity Ally was set up. Gabby and I have been doing this work for many years. And so we formed Diversity Ally to specifically serve the needs of the events industry because it is quite unique, as we're experiencing right now with the lack of kind of national governmental recognition of the industry, right? So it does have its nuances. And so what we do at Diversity Ally is provide that training. So just reach out to us and we can go through what the options might be if appropriate for your business.
Definitely. And obviously, we've had, as you would expect, a lot of people say, can they have the slides from your presentation? So we would encourage them to get in touch with you guys
Yeah.
directly.
Yeah,
Do you
just
want
get
to
in
let
touch.
them
We
know?
have Yeah, so it's I didn't, you know what, guys, I had it on a slide and just skipped that slide, so excuse me for that. It's www.diversityally.co.uk. But you can come and find us if you find us on LinkedIn, Gabby or I on LinkedIn. You'll be able to find the website really easily. And we also have this brilliant podcast. It is one of the most discreet ways. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is one of the most discreet ways you can learn about diversity and inclusion because no one has to know that you're listening to our podcast. But we interview lots of people from the events industry the world over and talk about the different things they're doing when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So there's some great case studies, examples of what's already happening if you listen to the podcast. We actually have a guide that's coming out, which is absolutely free, which covers these global benchmarks that we've created for the events industry. So please do reach out to us, find us on LinkedIn, access the website, because there's some brilliant resources on there specifically for you.
Brilliant. Right, thank you, Ashanti. That was a great talk, and I'm sure very many people found that quite useful. So appreciate you taking the time to come on.
Lovely. Thank you very much for
Thank
having
you.
me.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.